They told you to work hard, to keep your head down, your hands busy, your voice soft. That if you endured long enough, the pain, the fatigue, the hunger, you would be rewarded. That morality lives in the sweat on your brow. That sacrifice is sacred. That if you serve well, you will be seen. But what if they lied? What if the weight you carry is not proof of your strength, but the leash of your obedience? There's a strange silence that descends on the soul after 10 years of doing everything right and still being overlooked. It's not rage. Not yet. It's the eerie stillness of a man who realizes the rules he lived by were written by those who never meant for him to win. You clock in. You stay late. You say yes when others say no. And somewhere deep inside, you feel it, the quiet insult of invisibility. Not because you are weak, but because you are predictable. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't whisper comfort to the broken. He struck like lightning. He dared to ask the question most fear to entertain. What if your virtue is your captivity? What if your willingness to endure is the reason you are overlooked, underpaid, overused, forgotten? In The Will to Power, Nietzsche dismantles the fantasy of moral labor. He didn't see morality as a universal good, but as a historical strategy invented by the powerless to restrain the powerful, then adopted by the powerful to control the masses. It is a double-edged lie, first to protect the weak, then to pacify them. You were trained to be a moral laborer, not a free man. And like all well-trained men, you took pride in your exhaustion. You wore your fatigue like a badge of honor. You confused the ache in your spine for purpose. You mistook exploitation for meaning, because they told you it was noble to suffer. But suffering is not noble. It is useful to someone else. Nietzsche saw that virtue, when untethered from power, becomes a form of decay. You think your long hours, your humility, your patience will one day be noticed. But the system doesn't reward invisible strength. It exploits it. It needs you quiet. It needs you tired. It needs you grateful for crumbs while others feast. Look around. Who rises? Is it the silent worker, head down, loyal to the end? Or is it the one who understands leverage, the manipulator, the strategist, the one who dares to be seen without permission? You think they're cheating. Nietzsche would say they're awake. There's a rot beneath the praise you've received. They call you dependable. What they mean is, you can be counted on not to resist. They call you selfless. What they mean is, you won't demand more. They say you're a team player. What they mean is, you can be sacrificed without noise. And all the while, you keep pushing, keep striving, keep hoping that someday your loyalty will be reciprocated. But someday never comes. Because someday is the drug they feed you to keep you moving toward a door that was never meant to open. Nietzsche's rebellion wasn't against work. It was against illusion. Against the collective hypnosis that convinces men that quiet suffering is the highest form of virtue. That dying with integrity is better than living with power. He called it slave morality, a belief system born not from strength, but from fear. Fear of standing alone. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of power itself. But what if that fear is exactly what keeps you small? You weren't born to submit. You were born to create, to shape, to dominate reality with the force of your will. But somewhere along the way, you were taught that power is dangerous. That ambition is arrogance. That strategy is manipulation. And so you chose virtue. You chose fatigue. You chose a life that is digestible to others. But what did it cost you? That is the question Nietzsche throws like a dagger into the heart of your narrative. Not what you've gained, but what you've sacrificed to appear good. Your voice, your vision, your sovereignty. You think you're tired from the work, but you're not. You're tired from being unseen, from being small in a world that only respects magnitude. You were told that humility is strength, but Nietzsche knew the opposite, that true strength is the refusal to kneel before a lie. And this is the lie, that suffering is sacred, and that comfort is weakness. That submission is moral, and that power is corruption. That if you keep going, someday, someone will see. But they won't. Because the world does not reward the good. It rewards the bold. You don't need to become cruel, but you do need to become dangerous. Because until you confront the lie of moral labor, you will stay in the cage, calling it character. You will keep dying slowly, applauded by people who never intended to lift you. You will confuse your silence for dignity, your exhaustion for purpose, and you will die good, but never free. We grow up believing that hard work is sacred, that the path to a good life wins through obedience, humility, self-sacrifice. That if we endure the long hours, if we serve without question, if we bury our hunger behind professionalism, we will be protected, respected, rewarded. But Nietzsche looked into the heart of this belief and called it what it truly is, a strategy of the weak, designed not to elevate, but to pacify. He named it slave morality, a psychological fortress built by those who lacked power, who could not conquer, and who therefore had to convince themselves and everyone else that weakness was virtue. It is not a moral system born from truth. It is born from necessity, the necessity of survival in a world that favors strength. And once this morality took root, it became a tool not just for the oppressed to survive, but for the powerful to control. Because what better way to rule than to convince your subjects that their suffering is noble, that to serve is to be good, that to question authority is dangerous, that your dignity is found in submission? Modern society didn't destroy this mindset. It refined it. Look at how the modern worker is praised. Tireless, dedicated, humble. Look at how corporations frame it. We're a family. Do what you love. Go the extra mile. But beneath the slogans and perks lies a cold economic truth. The more you give, the more they take. Because they've already taught you that saying no is selfish, that wanting more is greed, that rest is laziness. You call it hustle. Nietzsche would call it domestication. This is not just about the workplace. It's about how morality has been weaponized to keep entire populations docile, compliant, waiting for a reward that never comes. The lie is systemic. The praise you receive is proportional not to your impact, but to your obedience. And the more you internalize it, the more invisible you become. How many people do you know who gave everything, time, energy, health, to a job, to a cause, to a relationship, only to be discarded the moment they were no longer useful? They weren't loved. They were leveraged. You might think your loyalty will be remembered, that your sacrifices will count, but systems don't remember. They recycle. People don't reward pain. They expect it. And the moment you believe your suffering entitles you to anything, you've already lost. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He watched a culture built on Christian morality, humility, meekness, turning the other cheek, and asked a heretical question. What if these values are not universal truths, but psychological chains? What if they were designed to tame the strong? And then, what if those chains have been modernized, disguised, made palatable? Today, we don't call it meekness. We call it professionalism. We don't call it obedience. We call it being a team player. But the function remains the same: to suppress the will to power, the inner force that drives creation, ambition, rebellion, sovereignty. Nietzsche wrote for the man who feels something dark and wild waking inside him, a hunger not for validation, but for freedom. He knew that man would suffer, that he would be hated, that society would label him arrogant, selfish, dangerous, because he cannot be used. And in a world built on use, the sovereign man is a threat. We praise martyrs more than masters. We glorify those who burn out in service of others, and we vilify those who dare to say, "My life is mine." We were taught to admire the nurse who works herself into the ground, but to resent the entrepreneur who builds his empire and refuses to apologize for it. Why? Because one is manageable. The other isn't. This is why the lie of moral labor persists. Because it benefits the structure. Because a man who grinds without question never becomes dangerous. Because a man who sacrifices without return never threatens the order. Because a man who ties his worth to his suffering will never rebel. He will die working and thank them for the opportunity. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you feel the hollowness behind the praise, the quiet indifference behind the applause, you begin to understand. You were not trained to succeed. You were trained to serve. And the tragedy is not that you failed. The tragedy is that you did exactly what you were told, and it still wasn't enough. Because it was never supposed to be. Nietzsche's call is not to bitterness. It is to awakening. He doesn't ask you to stop working. He demands that you start choosing. Not to grind blindly, but to build strategically. Not to be liked, but to be feared. not to seek praise, but to claim power. Because only when you stop equating suffering with virtue can you begin to live on your own terms. And for the first time, stop being the tool and become the architect. So what happens when the illusion collapses? When you finally admit that the system you trusted was designed to extract your energy, not elevate your worth. Most people don't rebel. They freeze. They double down. They tell themselves it's just temporary. That if they push harder, suffer more, wait longer, things will turn around. But they don't. And the truth is, this isn't a glitch in the matrix. It's the blueprint. You were conditioned to value endurance over impact, submission over strategy, loyalty over leverage. And now, standing at the edge of that realization, you're not just disillusioned. You're unarmed. Because your entire behavioral framework, the set of values you were praised for, was optimized for compliance, not autonomy. This is where Nietzsche stops being a philosopher and becomes a scalpel. He didn't offer motivational slogans. He offered dissection. He saw that once a man begins to awaken to the false morality around him, he doesn't suddenly become powerful. He becomes unanchored. Because there's no guidebook for how to live after you abandon the lie. That's where the revaluation of values comes in, not a call to find new beliefs, but to create them. Nietzsche's idea wasn't that you should replace obedience with disobedience. It was that you should replace inherited values with ones you construct consciously. Not because they're moral, not because they're admired, but because they serve your will. They align with what he called life-affirming instincts, desires that do not demand permission, but demand expression. It's not self-help. It's architectural. This is where people misunderstand Nietzsche. He didn't hate virtue. He hated unchosen virtue. He didn't mock sacrifice. He mocked sacrifice performed out of fear of disapproval. He didn't attack community. He attacked herd mentality, the psychological reflex that compels people to conform even when it contradicts their own survival. And if you think this only applies to peasants or followers, think again. Look at today's educated, credentialed, culturally aware professionals quietly degrading themselves in meetings they didn't want to attend, working hours that violate their body, pretending enthusiasm while watching less capable people rise faster. Not because they're stupid, but because they were trained to comply. They think that excellence alone will protect them. But Nietzsche would say, the system doesn't reward excellence. It rewards influence. It rewards narrative. It rewards control. So what's the countermove? Nietzsche doesn't say opt out. He says, stop outsourcing your identity to systems that exploit your agreement. If your values are borrowed, your power is too. If your standards are inherited, your outcomes are decided before you begin. That's why he speaks not of rebellion, but of overcoming. Not just defying others, but dismantling the inner voice that still seeks their approval. Because here's the hidden truth. Most people remain trapped not because they lack ability, but because they still want to be congratulated for being moral, for being good, for being useful. And usefulness is the leash. This is where the pain begins. Not when others exploit you, but when you finally admit that you allowed it, that you mistook recognition for value, that you chase fairness in a game designed for leverage, that you define success according to terms handed to you by the very people profiting from your obedience. It's not a breakdown. It's an audit. And Nietzsche's challenge is simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. If you want to live free, you must become willing to be misjudged, misunderstood, feared, hated, because those are the social costs of escaping moral labor. You stop justifying your hours. You stop explaining your goals. You stop negotiating your value. This is not a fantasy of dominance. It's a restructuring of self. It's what Nietzsche described as becoming a creator of values, not someone who adopts a new ideology, but someone who writes the rules they live by, and who accepts the isolation that often comes with it. That's the real resistance, not loud, not cinematic, but silent, structural, strategic. A life no longer optimized for praise, but for power. Not dominance over others, but refusal to be shaped by their reward systems. And that's where you finally begin to see clearly. You're not exhausted because you work hard. You're exhausted because you're waiting for permission to rest, to rise, to refuse, for permission to stop playing a rigged game and build your own. That permission will never come. And Nietzsche would say, that's exactly why it's yours to take. The exit from obedience doesn't begin with rage. It begins with reconstruction. Nietzsche never told you to burn the world. He told you to stop building cathedrals with someone else's blueprints. After you dismantle the moral architecture you inherited, all the illusions about work, sacrifice, loyalty, what you're left with isn't chaos. It's a cleared foundation. Most people mistake this emptiness for loss. But Nietzsche called it freedom. The first tool in this reconstruction is perspective shift, not positive thinking, not optimism, something colder. He called it perspectivism, the idea that every belief, every moral stance is a product of perspective, not truth. The worker who believes virtue is sacrifice sees life through the lens of centuries of moral propaganda. Change that lens, and the values collapse. So the worker becomes the observer. He starts asking a new kind of question. Who benefits from me holding this belief? It's not philosophical musing. It's a forensic audit. Who benefits when you believe that patience is strength? That humility is power? That suffering proves character? Who wins when you wait for recognition? This is the beginning of strength, the refusal to confuse internalized conditioning with personal conviction. From here, Nietzsche offers a second tool, will to power. This doesn't mean domination. It means interpretation. The power to define what matters, what's worth pursuing, what success even means, and to act on those definitions without waiting for consensus. It's not liberation through rebellion. It's sovereignty through design. And the design isn't moral. It's functional. Nietzsche says, test your values the way an engineer tests a bridge. Does it hold under pressure? Does it produce strength? Does it increase your agency? If it doesn't, it goes. This isn't comfortable. Most people don't want to be engineers of their value systems. They want to be passengers. They want the structure already built, the narrative already written, the rituals pre-approved. That's why religion worked. That's why corporate culture works. That's why the myth of the hardworking good man still gets applause. But Nietzsche's world has no applause. It has outcomes. Here's where most people quit. They confuse nihilism with freedom. They assume that if moral systems are arbitrary, then nothing matters. But that's not what Nietzsche argued. He warned that nihilism is what happens when you destroy inherited values without replacing them. The collapse isn't the danger. The vacuum is. So what fills it? Affirmation without illusion. The decision to live not in reaction to oppression, but in pursuit of creation. Not freedom from, but freedom to. And this is where Nietzsche forces you to confront your own complicity. Because it's easy to blame the system, the job, the culture, the lies. It's harder to admit that you chose stability over vision, that you surrendered ambition in exchange for praise, that you sabotaged your own power by performing safety for others. But if you can admit that, if you can own the fact that you played the part of the loyal worker, the noble sufferer, the selfless provider, then you can also rewrite the role, not into its opposite, not into a reactionary cynic, but into something Nietzsche called the Übermensch, not a superhero, not a tyrant, but a self-authored individual. What does that look like in modern terms? It looks like rejecting metrics you didn't invent. It looks like building skills not to become useful, but to become untouchable. It looks like making decisions that are costly in the short term, but sovereign in the long term. It's the man who stops measuring time in promotions and starts measuring it in leverage, who stops asking what will get him liked and starts asking what will give him range, who doesn't need to be agreed with because he didn't build his framework for others to live in. Nietzsche's final tool is detachment from the need to moralize your suffering. Most people cling to their pain because it gives them identity. I worked hard. I did the right thing. I played fair. These statements aren't just reflections, they're excuses for why they're still stuck. But the man who moves forward without needing to justify his past? That man is lethal. Not because he's angry, because he no longer needs to explain. And in a world addicted to justification, silence becomes dominance. That's Nietzsche's reconstruction, not a map, but a furnace. You don't follow it. You throw in everything you were taught and see what remains when the smoke clears. If all you find is ash, you weren't built on anything real. But if something solid emerges, something chosen, designed, untied from approval, then you've started. Not healing, building. The hardest part isn't seeing the lie. It's seeing how much of your life was built inside it. You followed the rules. You said the right things. You worked past exhaustion. You held on to beliefs that made you easier to manage, beliefs that earned you respect in theory, but silence in practice. When Nietzsche said that morality is the herd instinct in the individual, he wasn't insulting you. He was diagnosing you. Because most people don't serve out of weakness. They serve out of momentum. They keep grinding long after they've stopped believing. Not because they trust the system, but because they've bet everything on it. They fear what comes next more than they hate what they're in. They can't imagine a life that doesn't reward effort with dignity. So they keep moving. Head down, mouth shut, telling themselves they're principled. But they're just afraid of starting over. Nietzsche never promised you that the alternative was pleasant. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering friction. The kind of friction that either burns off delusion or reveals character. You don't just wake up one day and become free. You wake up, look around, and see that everything you were told to admire, obedience, sacrifice, moral labor, was designed to keep you waiting. Waiting for validation that never comes. Waiting for promotion, for fairness, for your turn. And in that waiting, your edge goes dull. Your presence gets quiet. Your instincts atrophy. That's the consequence of inherited virtue. It disconnects you from your own will. You begin living not as a strategist, but as an exhibit, proof of how good you are. How useful. How safe. But Nietzsche's entire body of work turns that on its head. The goal isn't to be admired. It's to be unmanipulable. And admiration makes you vulnerable. He wrote not for the polite, but for the dangerous. The man who doesn't need a label to act, who doesn't need the crowd's approval to build, who doesn't wait for the right moment to leave a game designed to drain him. This man is not chaotic. He's selective, strategic, unreachable by those who only understand leverage through guilt. What happens to that man? He becomes quiet, but not submissive. He becomes calculated, but not cruel. And from the outside, people say he changed. But he didn't. He stopped being predictable. And in this world, unpredictability is the last form of power. Now here's the part they don't want you to ask. Who taught you that struggle makes you worthy? Because that question breaks the entire contract. If your worth doesn't come from sacrifice, then the people who needed you to sacrifice lose control. They can't guilt you anymore. They can't stall you with praise. They can't remind you the right thing when your boundaries tighten. They only knew how to relate to you through your exhaustion. The moment you stop performing it, they have nothing. And you're finally left with choice. Not a blank slate, but something more difficult. A future that no longer hands you meaning, but demands you manufacture it. Nietzsche called this burden the weight of freedom. Because there's no one to blame anymore. No story to hide in. Only the question he left burning in every man who ever read him honestly. If no one else defines your worth, what will? That question has no universal answer. But it does have a universal cost. You lose applause. You lose moral high ground. You lose the protection of victimhood. And in its place, you gain control. Not control over others. Control over frame. The difference between a man who works and a man who builds his frame. One performs for approval. The other designs outcomes. One follows standards. The other creates conditions. One stays in place, waiting for fairness. The other leaves and becomes unfair, but effective. And in this shift, something irreversible happens. You no longer crave being seen as good. You crave being effective. Unapologetically. Precisely. Cleanly. You walk away not out of resentment, but because the table was never yours to begin with. That's what Nietzsche wanted you to see. That there is no reward for moral labor. Only outcomes. And those outcomes belong not to the compliant, but to the self-authored. So now ask yourself the question this entire system taught you to avoid. If your suffering no longer makes you worthy, what does? Leave a comment with your real answer. Not the one you were taught. The one that costs something to say. The one that makes you stop and stare at the life you built and ask whether it's still yours or whether it ever was.